Alright, so apparently now it is no longer being referred to as quid pro quo, but simply bribery. And
does this actually make any difference?
What do you think? Viva Frei in Montreal, litigator turned YouTuber, and Pudge is going back down to the floor. Ugh. According to various news outlets, and yes, they are right-leaning news outlets, the DCCC, the Democratic Campaign Congressional Committee? No, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee did some sort of internal focus group to determine how they should refer to the alleged quid pro quo against Donald Trump. And they did a poll to determine whether or not it should be referred to as quid pro quo, extortion, or bribery, and apparently the focus group decided that bribery had the most impactful forceful impact, was the best way to refer to what they are alleging Donald Trump to have done in his phone call with the president of Ukraine, Zelensky. Now, I am a lawyer, but unlike most lawyers, I am also a human. Terrible. And my first reflex is from a legal perspective, what is the actual difference in referring to it as quid pro quo, extortion, or bribery? Whereas from a human non-legal side, I know exactly what the difference is. When I hear the Latin phrase quid pro quo, which literally means this for that, I think Shakespeare. When I hear extortion and bribery,
I think Goodfellas.
It's just, you know, you're just funny. It's funny, you know, the way you tell the story and everything.
Funny how?
So there is the obvious human element as to how we react to things based on the name. And I am totally sensitive to that, and from a cynical perspective understand exactly why political campaigns hire these focus groups so they can determine what will have the greatest force on the general public's opinion. But from a legal perspective, there is in fact a very big, and I would argue a very dangerous distinction in accusing President Trump of a quid pro quo versus accusing him of extortion or bribery. It's something I've said in previous vlogs, and I will probably say it again in future vlogs. Publicly accusing someone of having committed a crime is potentially defamatory in the legal sense. And so there is a very meaningful distinction between accusing the president of having participated in a quid pro quo versus accusing the president of extortion and bribery. Alright, just to open up a slight parenthesis here, there's an entirely separate discussion about sovereign immunity and immunity of government officials in the conduct of their government duty. For those of you who may not have seen my live stream with Robert Barnes, the attorney for the Covington Catholic kids, who were suing a bunch of defendants, in particular Elizabeth Warren. In her defense, Elizabeth Warren had filed a motion to dismiss on the basis that she benefits from immunity, sovereign immunity, because when she made the allegedly defamatory tweets in question, she was acting in her official government capacity and therefore benefits from immunity and cannot be sued for the acts she carried out as a member of government in the context of her governmental duties.
Her third argument is a form of immunity. She argues that what she did in her official duties as a United States Senator, because she used the Twitter account that she calls her senator's Twitter account. So that's a purely personal decision. And that based on, and her view is, if you extend it logically, is that a federal politician can say anything they want about anyone they want, even if it's libel, a tort, invasion of privacy, infliction of emotional distress, invasion of false light, any of those kind of claims. As long as she says, I hereby say this as a United States Senator. My ex-husband is a criminal and a fraud. All of a sudden now her ex-husband, you get elected to Congress, and now you can libel your neighbor, you can libel your business partner, you can libel that guy down the street that you never liked. That's the scope of what your argument is. So it's the broadest expansion of that argument ever made in the history of U.S. law.
Well, her motion to dismiss was in fact granted on that basis. I'm going to be doing a follow-up vlog on it, but there is an entire discussion about sovereign immunity and whether or not government officials can get sued for the things they do in their capacity as government officials. But whatever, a subject for another vlog. Back to the current vlog right now. I understand the strategic reason for doing it. Quid pro quo doesn't mean very much to the layperson. It doesn't even mean that much to a lawyer because quid pro quo is itself not a crime. And so labeling something a quid pro quo, a this for that, it really just sounds like a trade. It doesn't sound like an impeachable offense. Call it bribery or extortion and people start to make their own connections, their own associations, and then in their own minds it might start to become an impeachable offense. But bearing in mind that we are at the stage of an impeachment inquiry where the House is going to determine whether or not they're going to approve articles of impeachment, as an attorney I think it can be very dangerous to start to refer to it as as an actual crime while it is merely at the stage of an inquiry. Incidentally, it's very analogous to what occurred in the Mueller report. You will recall if you saw my video on the subject, which I'll link right here. So the first very interesting thing to note is right at the beginning of Mueller's report, they specify that they are not looking for collusion per se, they're actually looking for conspiracy. And the reason for that is in criminal law, there's no such concept as collusion. Collusion is sort of a colloquial term about people working together to do something wrong, but in criminal law, it's known as conspiracy. And that is the threshold that they have to adopt and prove throughout the course of the investigation in order to prove collusion between the Trump campaign and Russian agents to work together to influence the election. And the reason for that is that there is no legal concept of collusion, but rather only conspiracy. Conspiracy literally meaning two or more people working in concert secretly for the purposes of some unlawful end. But even Mueller did not publicly accuse President Trump of conspiracy. He was investigating as to whether or not there are sufficient grounds to conclude that there was conspiracy. The very purpose of the impeachment inquiry, in theory, is to determine whether or not there are sufficient grounds to approve articles of impeachment against the president. To start publicly affirming and referring to it as an actual crime before the impeachment inquiry is even over to determine if there are sufficient grounds to approve articles of impeachment is, in my humble opinion, borderline reckless and bordering on actual defamation. This is a nonpartisan statement, but everybody understands exactly what's going on here. The very purpose of the impeachment inquiry, in theory, is to determine whether or not President Trump committed an impeachable offense in his dealings with the president of Ukraine, Zelensky. He is being accused of having strong-armed the president of Ukraine into reopening an investigation into one of his political rivals via withholding some $400 million in aid that was promised to Ukraine. At first, it was being referred to as an impeachable quid pro quo, unfair dealings, abuse of power, the president of the United States abusing of his office as president to pressure a foreign country into digging up dirt on a political rival. But according to this focus group, apparently the term quid pro quo wasn't stirring up the requisite passions that people wanted it to stir up, and they decided now to refer to it as bribery, and they have begun doing so.
The devastating testimony corroborated evidence of bribery.
Bribery.
I think it's a somewhat reckless door to be opening, not just from a political perspective, but actually from a legal one. And because I've been following this from the very beginning and reading a ton of comments in the comment section, I know that this also brings up another issue. A certain video of Joe Biden publicly declaring that he was going to see that $1 billion in loan guarantees was withheld from Ukraine unless they fired their top prosecutor at his insistence.
I went over, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid.
And while some are going to say that this is a classic whataboutism, others are going to say, no, not so fast. This is, in fact, a classic quid pro quo. Now, in fairness, to understand the argument is that Joe Biden was saying, we are withholding $1 billion in loan guarantees unless you fix up your corruption problem in Ukraine. And part of your corruption problem in Ukraine is that the prosecutor is not prosecuting corruption hard enough. That is the official context and explanation given to this Joe Biden quote. Proponents of the impeachment inquiry against Donald Trump are saying that he was on the phone with Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, saying, we're going to give you $400 million in aid, and would you do me a favor and look into this investigation into Burisma and Hunter Biden? The argument there being it's an obvious and implied quid pro quo. I am not using the other terminology because I am not here to defame anybody. Here's your $400 million in aid, and would you be a dear and look into this for me? And the defenders of Joe Biden are saying this was not a quid pro quo. He was not saying, here's $1 billion, now do what I want. He was saying, we'll only give you $1 billion in loan guarantees if you promise to really fight corruption. I've said this in previous vlogs, corruption is not always in your face, do this or this is going to happen. What makes corruption so insidious is that oftentimes you don't even need to say what needs to be done, it is understood. Here's $1 billion in loan guarantees, you better go fire that prosecutor and make sure you guys are tough on corruption. I'm not saying this is the case, and there is no but about that. People have this sort of Hollywood vision of what corruption is. Somebody shows up in an office with a briefcase full of cash, or someone shows up in an office with a hammer and says, you better do this or I'm going to break every bone in your hand. True corruption is a wink of an eye without the need to even wink. It's knowing what needs to be done based on the interests of the parties and not needing to say it. Anyhow, I think I may have rambled a little too much. All that to say, the shift from referring to the alleged impeachable conduct as quid pro quo versus bribery is where politics can meet the law. The desire to change the terminology terminology to something more impactful that will resonate more negatively with the general population is a political decision that can have legal ramifications. And if I were counsel to the DCCC, or anyone else for that matter, I would strongly advise against using criminal terminology to qualify someone's conduct publicly. It may have a stronger negative political impact, but it might also have a stronger negative legal impact. And it may in fact cross the line from political discourse to actual slanderous discourse. And just for the fun of it, I'm going to link a video on defamation right here. Give it a watch. If you like my content, be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, drop a comment in the comment section below. I have a PayPal support option somewhere up in the banner of the YouTube channel, and I'll post that and merch links down below. And now you know your vlog. Peace out. Booyah!